Alright, time for some little notes. First off, in the comments section of part 3, some people mentioned that they were a bit confused as to when I'm talking about 2003 and when I'm talking about Brotherhood. Basically, when an image has black bars on the side, it's from 2003. When it takes up the whole area, it's from Brotherhood. Hopefully that clears things up. If I just missed the point and people were actually confused about something else, please just let me know in the comments below. Second, it's here that Brotherhood and the manga become very similar a lot of the time. So for those cases when Brotherhood and the manga have no differences I feel are worth pointing out, or where it's more useful to speak of them as a singular unit, I'm going to be referring to them as Mangahood. Just thought that I'd mention before diving into this so that those of you who haven't heard me call it that before aren't perplexed by this strange, made-up word I'm using. That's about it for that. Now we can get right into the... I thought I turned that off.
Are you a moron?
Brotherhood, I told you to stop calling me.
This is the perfect time! The ultimate opportunity!
The ultimate opportunity for what? What are you even talking about?
Are you humans always such pathetic worms?
Listen, I'm about to get back to you. I know I didn't talk about you for a little while, but, I mean, you were patient this long, you can keep being patient, okay?
You'll never get another chance!
Besides, you're gonna get way more time later. I mean, I'm already really far into 2003. I've hardly even talked about you.
There's no way!
No way? No way for what? What are you even talking about? Why do you keep calling me?
Never!
Just be quiet.
Impossible.
Just be quiet.
How could you?
Okay?
How could you do it?
Listen. Now we've reached the point in the story where Ed and Al are on a hunt for Marcoh, and they know his location because of a tip they were given in the other brother's Elric. Or at least that's what they're doing in 2003. In Brotherhood and the manga, they just kind of run into him accidentally. I tend to prefer it when characters are actively pursuing something and when, through their actions, they come closer to what they're looking for. So I prefer the way 2003 structures the boys finding Marcoh. However, it's not as though 2003 isn't guilty of some accident-driven storytelling moments as well. For example, there's this moment in the Phantom Thief episode where Ed simply happens to walk in on Siren using alchemy and thus learns her identity. The good thing is that no version of Fullmetal Alchemist is particularly prone to accident-driven storytelling, so this is an exception rather than a rule. Still, regardless of how prevalent this problem is, it's worth bringing up. In all versions of the story, Ed and Elle go through this town Marcoh lives in to talk to various townspeople. It gives us a real sense of how much these people depend on and need Marcoh, a sense of all the good he's done, which makes it pretty surprising when Marcoh greets Ed and Al with a gun. The difference between 2003 and Mangahood here is that in Mangahood, Armstrong is with the boys and he ultimately forces Marcoh to settle down. He takes control of the situation, so the boys don't have to. In 2003 though, Armstrong isn't there with them, so Ed and Al have to deal with this unfortunate situation on their own. This is yet another way that 2003 shows how self-reliant the boys need to be, and it exemplifies the idea that they aren't getting nearly as much help on their quest as they do in Mangahood. While placing more emphasis on Ed's actions is more important in 2003, or at least I think so, as I see it as mostly being a character study of Ed, Mangahood has a much wider focus. Sure, Ed is the protagonist, but in some ways Mangahood is about how insignificant Ed is, and one of the ways it goes about showing that is by sometimes taking control away from Ed and by placing emphasis on the side characters who surround him. Meanwhile, 2003's way of showing this is by giving Ed the illusion of control. As such, it places him in extremely restrictive situations where he has to make hard choices, or where there's seemingly no choice for him to make at all that still lines up with his personal values. Personally, I find 2003's character-focused nature more compelling, especially at these earlier stages in the story, but that's not to say that Mangahood is doing anything wrong by having other characters have more focus in these earlier chapters. In fact, if that emphasis on other characters wasn't there as the story goes on, then we wouldn't have some of the best moments in the series. After this, Ed and Al go and talk with Marcoh. In 2003, Marcoh recounts some of what he did during the Ishbal War, and as he talks, this amazing piece of music plays, with a harmonica humming out a soft, sorrowful melody. Throughout the scene, the tension between Ed, Al, and Marcoh is palpable. Part of the reason for that is, as usual, the show establishes significant connections between Ed, Al, and whoever they are with. Here, as Marcoh tells the boys some of what has happened, we cut to Rose. Just as Marcoh used alchemy to aid in creating death and destruction in Ishbal, the boys have aided in creating death and destruction in the Ore, even if the circumstances surrounding their actions in each of these locales are wildly different. Then Ed finds the Philosopher's Stone in Marcoh's room and tries to take it by force, but Al runs over and grabs Ed, telling him that what he's doing is wrong and that they aren't going to steal it. Meanwhile, in Mangahood, the scene goes much smoother. For example, Ed doesn't try to take the stone from Marcoh. Then there's the fact that Armstrong is here, which I've already talked about. Because of this, the conversation is very subdued and simple. Marcoh tells the boys that they aren't going to get what they want, and then they leave. However, just as they're about to board the train, Marcoh gives them a note that tells them where they go to find his research materials. From the plot points themselves and the conflict, the way this whole scene is laid out, and the way it's shot in Brotherhood, it all just feels very routine. However, it's not like there's no good reason for these differences between levels of conflict in 2003 and Mangahood at this point. 2003 is already 14 episodes in, while Brotherhood is on episode 6 and the manga is on chapter 8. If 2003 wasn't a bit more intense than Brotherhood at this point, if it hadn't picked up some steam, that would be a sign of weakness on its part, while the fact that Mangahood hasn't picked up some steam is simply symptomatic of the place it's at in its story. Basically, almost all the pieces are in place in 2003, and from here it's about what happens with those pieces. In Mangahood, however, those pieces are still being collected. As such, these stories are using similar plot points for incredibly different purposes, and since I'm going through everything in chronological order, it may seem that 2003 has some huge advantage in this regard. And while I do prefer a lot about it to Mangahood, I don't think it's quite fair to say that this is one of those things that I see as better in 2003. In other words, yeah, sure, I like this scene with Marcoh in 2003 more, but that's because its purpose in terms of conflict escalation and thematic weight is so different from Mangahood's. It's just more important here. After all, Mangahood is going to get into the Ishbal war stuff more later, so why would it go through that now? All of this is to say that if you ever feel like I'm spending a lot more time on 2003 than I am on Mangahood, this is why. And if you feel like I'm praising 2003 a disproportionate amount, well, this is sometimes why that's happening. For this reason, in 2003, Marcoh and the boys are going to spend a lot more time together here, as Marcoh's not going to be appearing much more after the events of this episode and the next. This affects other aspects of these episodes that I'm going to be discussing, such as the way it handles a major battle with Scar. Now, in 2003, Marcoh gets taken away by the Iron Blood Alchemist and other soldiers. However, just as we think that Ed and Al's conflict with the Iron Blood Alchemist is about to come to a head, Scar swoops in, blows up the Iron Blood Alchemist's car, and murders him real fast. On one hand, I find this anticlimactic and kind of disappointing. It could have been nice to have a bit more of a struggle between Scar and the Iron Blood Alchemist, or to have Ed and Al get involved. However, this does have a purpose. The fact that Scar can take out the Iron Blood Alchemist so fast shows just how strong and threatening he is, and how dangerous he will be for Ed and Al. The show also begins to draw parallels between Scar and his brother and Ed and Al, with how Scar says that Ed's eyes remind him of his brother's. Considering that both Ed and Scar's brother attempted human transmutation and created a homunculus in this version of events, it's important to start laying the groundwork for connections between these characters. And after Armstrong appears and he and Scar start fighting, the show cuts to Rose, who is in the middle of a war zone. Through this, we see just how much destruction the government can cause, and we get a deeper look into Scar's position. Sure, he may be a disturbed murderer, but there's a reason for what he's doing. He's only destructive because the government is destructive. Plus, having Rose return like this allows for this scene, where she talks about how her legs are just fine and is brave even in the face of this level of danger. Considering that she's going to return later on, I think it's good to highlight how much of an effect Ed has had on her. This fight with Scar in Mangahood is quite a bit different, and it happens before Ed and Al go to meet Marcoh. Still, it's an exciting, dynamic fight, and it shows Ed and Al in an incredibly desperate situation. Since this takes place almost immediately after the Nina incident, it's here that Mangahood fast-tracks Ed and Al's emotional journey. Basically, instead of having Ed get depressed the way he did in 2003, Scar attacks before there's much of a chance to explore that, Ed gives up during the fight but is saved, and then Al gets ticked off at him for giving up. Specifically, Al is upset that Ed would have been willing to let himself die so long as Al is kept alive. While I personally like the way that 2003 slows down its pace and homes in on Ed's emotional issues, I also appreciate how Mangahood addresses those things, but still quickly gets the story back to its central ideas. As I've mentioned recently, I view 2003 more as a character study, while I view Mangahood as an action-adventure story. Obviously, there's overlap between those two things, and that's not my way of saying that Mangahood has bad characters. I think it has great characters, actually. But the way Mangahood gets back to the adventure so quickly is one of the reasons I feel that it is more of an action-adventure story. However, I have a bit of a complaint about this moment in Mangahood. I can't help but question how all these vehicles managed to pull up and block Scar's path to escape, how all these soldiers got out and got their guns ready without Scar noticing. It's just a bit silly and contrived. To be honest, it doesn't bother me that much, but it does kinda take me out of the moment during these otherwise well-done fight scenes. This sort of thing is present in 2003 as well, even if it's not as noticeable or as extreme. In all three versions, Mustang then gets involved and starts antagonizing Scar. Mustang even tries to fight Scar, despite the fact that it's raining outside, which means he can't use his alchemy. So he ends up looking like a fool and Hawkeye kicks his feet out from under him and berates him for doing that. While I understand that this is meant to be comedic relief, I'm not a fan of it, as I feel this runs contrary to Mustang's character. I mean, sure, he can be headstrong and overconfident, but he's generally portrayed as poised and intelligent. Honestly, I don't think he could have gotten this far in his quest to overtake the government if he wasn't that way. At best though, I suppose this moment could be meant to show just how dependent he is on Hawkeye. Maybe I'm just overestimating his character. Of course, in 2003, it's around this time that we hear more about the Ishbal War of Extermination. However, I'm going to go back to that part later, as Mangahood doesn't focus on this the same way 2003 does now for quite some time, and I'd rather cover that topic once we reach it in Mangahood. One of my favorite parts of this battle in 2003 is Ed and Al's conversation about equivalent exchange. It's pretty brief, but it gives us an even deeper sense of the conflict within Scar, and how his logic doesn't really add up. As Ed basically says, what's the point of your revenge if there's no such thing as equivalent exchange for what you've lost? So what's the point if you can't get back what's already gone? Of course, Scar doesn't have an answer for that. Now for the aftermath of the battle with Scar, where Al gets on Ed's case for how he's acted. In 2003, this scene is treated as incredibly serious and there's a lot of weight to it. There isn't any slapstick comedy or changes in art styles. The manga, meanwhile, has some subtle humor in this section, but nothing that's really in your face. Like how there's this line of military people just standing there and watching as Ed and Al argue. Overall, it's treated very seriously, and I think that's how it should be treated too, as it's one of the most serious moments for these brothers. Then there's Brotherhood. In this version, there's some sad sounding music playing, but then Al punches Ed and there's this ridiculous sound effect as he spins in the air and the music cuts out. Then that happens again. Even before reading the manga and watching 2003, this sequence really annoyed me. The characters were almost killed. Can't we spend just a little time being serious before we get back to the gags? I mean, I understand that this is an attempt to undercut some of the tension with humor. First of all though, I don't see why we need to undercut the tension. Even so, if the tension is going to get undercut a bit, I think it would have been better to have some more subtle humor here, like in the manga. But Brotherhood has a habit of leaning into the manga's humor, for better or worse, which leads to my second point. Regardless of one's opinion on it, this isn't particularly accurate to the manga. Now, it's not like Brotherhood has to be through and through accurate to the manga, but this is another one of those moments I think of when people tell me that Brotherhood is super accurate to the source material. And I guess in a lot of ways it is. But differences like this, and some of the more significant differences as far as structuring go that I've previously discussed, makes the statement that it follows the manga a bit of an oversimplification. Despite all the differences I've gone through lately, 2003 and Mangahood still tend to come back to similar ground. At this point, that similar ground is Ed and Al going back to their hometown to visit with Winry and Pinako, as Ed needs to get Winry to fix his automail. However, there are still differences, even when the stories are more similar than they have been for a little while. One difference in 2003 is that Hughes is the one who tells Ed and Al that Scar killed Nina. Though this is a pretty questionable decision on Hughes' part, it shows how much trust he has in the boys, and telling them this also puts him in a position of trust with them. At this point, Hughes is one of the few people who can break through to Ed and Al, despite their increasing levels of seclusion and despite the fact that they're becoming more and more reliant on themselves. They still trust Hughes, which gives us the moment where Ed salutes Hughes and apologizes for using his left arm. This moment has real dramatic weight. Ed rarely shows respect of this sort to anyone. It seems like Hughes is one of the few people he would salute like this and really mean it. Of course, the salute is also in Mangahood, but because of the overall context of each series, it stands out more in 2003 than it does in Mangahood. Part of this is that Hughes has been around more in 2003, though we'll return to that when we spend more time focusing on Hughes' relationship with Ed. Plus, 2003 adds in that line where Ed apologizes for using his left arm, which makes the action itself more earnest. 2003 also has this unique Detour episode, which has some interesting moments. See, Ed and Al get separated because Al is accidentally removed from the train they're traveling on. Since Ed just learned more about the war, this episode shows him gaining a better understanding of the horrors of war, getting a better grasp of what the Ishbal War of Extermination really means for those who are part of it. However, it's important to be clear that he does understand horror. I mean, of course he does. With his mother and the whole botched human transmutation thing, I think it'd be hard not to. But he realizes that these sorts of traumatic events are affecting others, even if he can't see it, and that these horrible things affect everyone in different ways. First off, the way he lashes out at Armstrong about the war, telling him that he heard from Marcoh about all the things that happened then, makes it clear that Ed doesn't quite understand the guilt many of these soldiers already live with. Then, while Ed is hunting for Al, his automail leg is stolen by this little girl who wants to give it to her grandpa to use. After chasing the girl, Ed and this man end up discussing the way that horrible things can shape people's lives, how somewhat similar experiences can affect different people in extremely different ways. After all, while Ed is on a journey to get his and his brother's bodies back, this man doesn't want to have his legs fixed or to make his life easier, because he was a soldier and that's how he lost his leg, and his difficulty moving reminds him of what he did during the Ishbal War. I really like how this scene is shot. Throughout Ed's conversation with this man, a clock is set between them. Of course, it stands in for time, emphasizing the general themes that go along with the passage of time, giving the audience the sense that Ed could become like this man. Ed's position within the army makes this clear, and this leads into another connection between them as far as time is concerned. If Ed had been part of the army at a different time, if he had been a state alchemist just a little bit earlier, he could have been ordered to partake in the Ishbal War and would have probably done some of what this man did. Tied up with this symbol is how much time Ed and Al have spent searching for their bodies. We've been following them on their quest for years now, and here they still are, searching and searching, trying to fix a horrible mistake they made. Because of this, Ed even begins to talk about how he's losing faith in the very laws of alchemy, and the very laws that have governed so much of his thoughts and actions, including those in the town of Lior. Ed's conversation with this man also leads to a question. What will Ed do if he succeeds? What comes after he gets his and his brother's bodies back? Since this has been his purpose for so long, that's not necessarily an easy question to answer. For all this time, his existence has been defined by this tragedy, by the loss of his mother, and by his and his brother's failed human transmutation. Moving on from that, even after success, is a hard thing to imagine. And I really like how 2003 slows down and forces Ed to confront these things about himself and about the journey he's on with his brother. Now that we've gone through that, we can talk about Ed and Al's time in their hometown. I think this little breather is important, especially since Mangahood and 2003 are going to be taking a turn for the worse soon, and this is a great way of reminding us of Winry's role within the story, especially in Mangahood, where she plays a more major role than she does in 2003. As far as these events themselves go though, there aren't any huge differences between any versions of Fullmetal Alchemist. I guess in 2003 this dog laughs, which I don't know, it's kind of scary. Kind of makes me uncomfortable. Don't really know what to do with that. Anyway, one difference here is that there's more emphasis being put on Al losing his humanity. For example, in this section, Al starts talking about how he can't remember people's faces. These sorts of moments, combined with Al's overall dependency on Ed in moments like the last episode where he got lost, allow the show to build up to Al's whole identity crisis a bit more. 2003 also adds in this little anecdote about how Ed and Al's mom would always shine a light from the window on their second floor, telling them to come home once it got dark out. And Winry does the same thing now. While the sentiment here is pretty obvious, that doesn't stop it from being sweet. Even if Ed and Al have burned down their own home, even if their mother is gone and they've changed so much, they will always have a home to return to with Winry. Considering what's going to happen in Conqueror of Shambhala, this is actually pretty tragic. Regardless of these differences though, this section is largely just a pleasant reminder of Ed and Al's past relationships, and some time for the boys in the audience to slow down and take in all that has recently happened in the story.